The things I think that bring us the most joy, and this is, I don't know, this is a theory, bring us the most joy, make us happy, give us meaning in life. They're carbon neutral. They're not high intensity energy use. They are being able to sort of make connections to people in your community. They are spending time with your family and loved ones. They are creating things and enjoying small moments where you live. Now, that is sort of interesting when you think about what we spend most of our energy on, right? And we go back to talking about junk mobility, right? We're, spending a lot of carbon, spending a lot of energy, spending a lot of money on things that maybe don't bring us the most joy. So I'm really interested in this kind of, alignment between climate action and happiness and sort of human thriving. Because I do think that the answer has to be, we solve the climate crisis and we accidentally thrive in the process.
Hi, I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich, founder of The Goodness Exchange and host of the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. At this podcast, you'll hear conversations that generate one aha moment after another for you. There is an enormous wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows enough about yet. And yes, it is still an amazing world. And on this podcast, we'll introduce you to the people making it that way. And here's the thing. Even though the thought leaders I talk to every week are knee-deep in tackling some of the world's biggest problems, they still think the future is bright. We need to see what they see, and we can. And I'm hoping that this conversation is going to be one of those moments where a whole new landscape of possibility opens out for you. So our guest today is an amazing fellow that we wrote an article about his area of expertise at the Goodness Exchange. And at the end of this podcast, I'll link you to that article. And also we'll put it in the show notes so you don't have to miss a thing. So welcome, Blaine Merker. Blaine, I'm going to give a little bio for you, and it's going to fall far short of everything that needs to be said about your work, but I'll give it a whirl and then you can listen on your story a little bit. Okay?
Sounds good.
All right. So Blaine is an urban designer inspired by the challenge of making cities that support human happiness, connection, and health. Well, heck, I thought that's the way it always was. I thought that's been the goal of cities evolving since the beginning of time, but not really. Turns out through most of the last century, cities have been designed not for people, but for cars. When I first understood this notion, I thought of places like Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, where there's just a sliver of availability of the shore and then 10 lanes of highway. Or things like the Big Dig, in Boston. City planners were realizing that they had this huge roadway cutting right through the heart of such a beautiful historic city. And then there's what Blaine talks about when he talks about the amount of paved parking that we have created in the United States, equivalent to the size of the state of Georgia. This is a lot of space and beautiful space devoted to cars. And Blaine's work is putting the ship right on that. He works for an amazing company called GEL, and I'll let him tell us about his role in that company and just a little bit about how he came to this way of adding his knowledge and zone of genius to what's making the world a brighter place. So, Blaine, I know that falls far short, but welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Linda. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit, expand on what I said and talk to us a little bit about your story and how you got here.
You bet. I'll kind of start at the present maybe and sort of work back.
Okay.
Currently, I am a director and partner at a company called GEL. We're based actually in Copenhagen. We were started in Copenhagen in 2000, but kind of have been around as a practice going back more than 40 years. And the name is Danish because it's named after our founder, Jan Gehl, who I'll talk a little bit more about, who kind of pioneered the science of behavior and space together and understanding sort of how the spaces we live in affect our behavior and how we can observe behavior to better design spaces. So it turned out there was a great demand for that kind of expertise around the world. So his practice kind of went from an academic one to really kind of a global leader in this field. And I was fortunate enough to start the US offices of Gale when we moved here in 2014. So I started up the West Coast office. I'm now one of the leaders in that office. We've got a great group of people, growing team. We do projects all over the world, North and South America, and then actually every continent except Antarctica currently. So we're a small but mighty company, but really focused on this thing that you said, making cities for people. That is our mission. We are out there to tip cities back to a human focus rather than, I guess you could call it a machine focus.
I want to interrupt just enough to say something that you said to me in our short pre-call that it just really got to me. You said, we've taken all the joy and humanity out of our streets. This is so true when you think about the way we zoom along on the streets and we don't make eye contact and they're just not built to stand still for 1 second. You've got to keep moving or be run over. We've let sort of like the discipline of engineering create what we got, instead of letting communities of people talk about what they need and what they want. So yeah, keep on going. I just think it's a fascinating upside down approach to the future.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the street is such an interesting place in our cities historically, right? I mean, for thousands of years, it functioned as a place. It functioned as a meeting place for communities. It was a place of commerce, a place for children to play. It was a place for old people to sit and watch young people move by. It was a place to connect with neighbors, to know what was going on. And you could really think of it as the primary public space of the city. There are ceremonial spaces like, in the ancient Rome, the Forum or the market or, the Agora in Greece, but those are actually more the sort of exception than the rule of the street as the primary organizer of public life in cities. It's only in the last 100 years or so that we have, you could say, sort of repurposed entirely the function of streets for movement and for the movement mostly of mechanized vehicles, of heavy vehicles, sort of heavier and heavier every year. And the cost to us, I think, has been kind of so incremental that we haven't noticed it. Kind of the frog in the boiling water. We don't really realize what we've lost. But it's a fascinating place to think about. And I guess maybe for your listeners, I'd just say, when you think about streets, you probably have a few that you think are really wonderful. Maybe you think about your stroll down the Champs-Élysées or something, or some street that, was really lovely that you grew up on. And probably 99% of the rest of your memories are like not worth remembering. They're just kind of banal. And why is that?
Okay. All right. So that takes us right to something I just loved that you said. One is that, and I'll have you comment on this first, that cities are the biggest cooperative enterprises that humans have put together. I never thought of it like that, but cities make us cooperate.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's great research around this, and about actually people's attitudes towards strangers and openness to cooperation, openness to new experience, correlating with people living in urban contexts and kind of closer to one another in neighborhoods, right? So Jane Jacobs, the famous American observer of cities who fought Robert Moses, actually, who was building freeways in New York in the 1960s, she famously observed this idea of eyes on the street and the way that neighbors took care of each other's kids, mainly because they were sharing the street. They were actually able to sort of safely cooperate. But cities as a whole, really, I mean, they're our biggest artifact. They're our biggest designed object that we have. And I just think it's so fascinating. Tim Cook at Apple just unveiled the newest iPhones this week. And, it fills an auditorium and the internet's ablaze for this design object that's like 3 by 5 inches. And we have so much reverence for this thing. Why don't we have that for the biggest design object that we have, which is the city? This is an iPhone on a cosmic scale that we've created over the last centuries, and we should treat it that way.
This is like an aha moment to me. Maybe not. I've been in cities all over the world. I'm not a city dweller. I live in the country. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping you're not hearing too much of the bird feeder that's like 1 foot away from me over here. But it is a sort of a revelation to think about it in the terms you just put it. How much energy and fastidiousness has been applied to this thing that we're carrying around in our pocket, and the everyday places where our feet touch the planet seem to have gotten almost no sorry, almost no consideration when how they make our lives better.
Yeah, and I think it's partly because it is a collective endeavor that the authorship of the city is maybe not as clear. But I guess what I'd love for your listeners to know is that the city is just as designed as an iPhone. In fact, every square inch of it has been, you could say, almost predetermined in a lot of cases by a set of rules and codes. It is sort of like the code of a computer that have been copied and pasted for decades. And that really was not the case 100 years ago. Before the sort of dawn of the modern age, cities were a little more kind of organic, and there were some certain agreements about how people came together, but it was really the city was kind of the result of real estate and community, and with the public realm being the result largely of just kind of people's individual community choices coming together. In the 1920s, a couple things happened. We had the creation of engineering standards related to the private automobile. And this is really driven by car companies who were getting a super bad rap at the time because their cars were running over mostly children, because that's where the street is where children played. And so they didn't want to be kind of associated with that. And so the idea was, if we can engineer the children out of the street, we can sell more cars. I mean, that's just the basic kind of history of it. At the same time, we also had a movement in some cities to create zoning, which zoning is a framework by which we sort of designate different parts of the city for different activities. And at first, the idea was to kind of remove noxious activities like rendering plants from next to people's houses. So there was the health and safety reason. But very quickly, it actually started being used to limit people of color from living next to white people. And that actually, I hate to say, was first pioneered in the city that I live in, Berkeley, California. And the city has just now actually removed these laws and sort of renounced the kind of purpose of zoning as a segregation tool. So these trends kind of started, and then they picked up steam, and they've kind of been going ever since for the last 100 and 120 years. And, we can talk more about kind of what the effect has been, but that's the code, unfortunately, that we're running.
And then you mentioned something that I never really thought about either. I was really young or not even born when this was going on, but there was like a mass flight out of cities in the 1950s to suburbia, 60s, and there was a lot of deep decay going on in cities. And then in the last 50 years, that sort of reversed. Tell us to us about that concept.
Sure. I mean, the flight, what is sometimes called white flight or suburban flight, it's really, it was kind of a crossing of those two forces that I just talked about, zoning and transportation design. So when you had the kind of Interstate Highway Act that Eisenhower signed into law, and, this massive investment in large roads, and then single family zoning that created a sort of an exclusive zone outside of city centers, which, by the way, depressed the actual kind of amount of housing available to everyone, because it made housing more expensive, and it forced people to only live in single families, right? So you couldn't have intergenerational families anymore living in that zoning, right? So grandma couldn't live with you and take care of the kids. That kind of those two factors crossed in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? And so you really had this kind of emptying out of American cities and disinvestment. And I mean, we're seeing a turnaround, actually, because for the first time in the last generation, folks have started to move back into cities. The trend has sort of changed, but we're still dealing with decades of disinvestment from those city centers.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of this. There's this beautiful quote. I don't know if it came from you, but I know I heard it as I was doing my research on you. You said, and I know now that I think about it, you said it to me in our pre-interview. You said, there should not be any throwaway moments in life. The idea that we've built this system of getting place, a system that's punishing and lonely, just is a big waste of a lot of moments. I
Yeah.
added that. I added that last sentence. But talk to me about this. There should be no throwaway moments. And yet we've created this punishing, lonely system.
Yeah. I mean, the promise of what it means to drive in your car, right? According to the car ads, is kind of windows down, wind in your hair, moving fast, going great places in an opening landscape, seeing the Grand Canyon out in front of you or something. That's not how we spend most of our time in our cars. If we have built a system kind of where we need our cars to do everything now, we need it to get to work, we need it to get groceries, we need to pick up our kids and get our kids to their friends' houses, we need to see our relatives. So really it's become our default transportation system. But again, like the sort of frog in the water, we haven't noticed that it has slowly kind of made us less happy. And I have a car. Look, I'm not a zealot. I love going on road trips, but I think that the car is really best for getting between city A and city B or driving through the country. It's for the open road. Your trip to your daycare is not the open road. Your trip, to Safeway is not your open road. So we've sort of been sold a story that actually kind of isn't our daily experience. And there's some really interesting research around this. I mean, some researchers in Scandinavia found that adding an hour to your commute is the equivalent in happiness terms, in reported happiness terms, of taking a 40% pay cut. Vice versa, removing an hour from your commute is equivalent to getting 40% raise. People who have a 90-minute commute tend to think about, they tend to worry on average they're 40% more than people who have a 30-minute commute, but that wasn't found in people who walk and bike. So, these are like little anecdotes, but I think all of us can kind of reflect for ourselves where the moments of frustration and boredom and kind of feeling isolated in our lives might be. Maybe different for everybody, but I would sort of suggest that for a lot of us, it's in our cars. And if I could just sort of propose anything, it would be like, does it really have to be that way? I mean, we chose it. We chose the situation. We designed it. We can design it a different way too.
That is such a big point. You have this great term. Let's see, where did I write it down? You said, when we separate destinations too much, we displace nourishing mobility. I think that's the open road feeling that you're describing that makes us feel sort of excited and free. We replace it with junk mobility that makes us feel bored, trapped, and stressed out. I this is it.
Yeah. And the other kind of nourishing mobility I'd offer is to be on foot, to be on a bicycle, or to even be in a vehicle with other people who might be strangers to you. Now, I don't want to take away from the fact that actually some really important family time happens in the car. I'll say that's true for my family, at least. I have two young boys, and a lot of good times happen in the car. But there's something about being out there with your fellow residents, fellow citizens, fellow humans on Earth, where you're doing things together. And actually, transit has the ability to be that. I think if it's done well. I mean, transit doesn't get a very good rap in the US, but you go to places where transit systems work really well and they're invested in, they're clean, they run on time, there's a great user experience. They are lovely public spaces. They're lovely places to see your fellow humans. So I think there's a lot of ways that nourishing mobility can show up, but it is certainly possible to design that experience. And I'd say just removing the amount of mobility that we need. We don't need to put everything so far apart that we need to spend an hour getting everywhere. And that really has to do, again, with this idea of zoning, the idea that we have pushed things that we need further apart from each other. And so it becomes actually harder to get them, which is a really interesting paradox.
That leads me to something that I remember you said to me that I thought, oh, we got to talk about this. You said cities are experiments. We're always living out the experiment that our grandparents' generation created. And that goes so well with what you just said.
That's right. I mean, what's so interesting about cities is that there have been, every generation has this great big idea about what a city should be. And, in the 1920s, it was the dawn of modernism. It was this idea that sort of function trumped form, and we needed to be very concerned with what the kind of everything had to have its own function and be its own place. And you saw that in architecture and all kinds of design. And it was, it was rationalism applied to the city. It took 75 years for that vision to finally work its way from some big experiments to some smaller cities to now it's sort of part of, that code, that you could say that computer code that runs kind of our urban civilization. I'm really interested in how we can kind of increase the clock speed on these experiments, because we just live in an age where we don't have time to live out the experiments of our grandparents in our own lives. We need to be living kind of the experiments of our grandchildren. We need to be thinking about, what is it that we can be doing now that will make the planet for them that they need, that can make the city for them that they need.
Okay, so I'm just going to own it. People are seeing me looking down. I'm taking careful notes here. Blaine, you're really dropping some really thoughtful things for us to contemplate there. This trying to speed up the experiment time is huge. You made me think of, the automobile commercials in the 1930s and 40s, showing these happy families and 2-car garage homes and all that. Well, it did take 50, 60 years to see that play out. But by then we didn't want it as much anymore.
Yeah. Or we realized we couldn't afford it. We realized that wasn't maybe, the best use of our resources. I mean, there's a statistic that actually just before we got on the call here, I was looking up the category of Americans' consumer spending that is the largest is transportation. So we spend more of our income on getting around than anything else. And we spend more than other countries do. So there's something about that investment and the kind of idea about what the 2-car garage is that might not be working out so well, at least in terms of what we think, we get joy from. And then when you look at that by income group, that hits hardest on middle and lower income folks. And, we see this kind of across the board, in terms of traffic safety too. We look at who is impacted most by vehicle crashes, pedestrian injuries and deaths. It's 3 groups of people. It's young people, it's children, it's older people, and it's people of color. So when we kind of look at who the system is working for and who it's not, it tends to be, unfortunately, most impacting the people who can kind of help themselves the least, who have the least means. At the same time, I mean, this is true kind of from the beginning in our history, but it's really caught up to everybody, I think. I think we are all kind of looking at, wow, things are really expensive. Can I really afford this car payment too, and the gas that goes along with it? So the tricky thing is we've just sort of got ourselves a little bit into a situation where it's hard to get out of it, right? Mm-hmm. And, I think that's so interesting in the space that I try and work in is actually how do we kind of walk this back in a way by finding these little points where things can work differently and sort of proving them out.
So give us some fun examples. Give us a couple of fun examples of things that we might not know about or that we might know about that are perfect examples of this kind of change in thinking about what we give our space to.
Well, I didn't really finish doing my bio actually. So just working backwards from the year in 2014 when I started the offices of Gale. Before that, I had founded an art collective called Rebar. And back in 2005, one of our first projects was just this kind of fun experiment, this little appropriation of a public space, which just happens to be the metered parking spot on the street. And we had kind of discovered this as almost like a loophole in the municipal code, which says that you can rent that real estate, that 20 by 10 foot piece of real estate for, let's say it's $2 an hour in 2005. Well, when you math that out, that is the cheapest 200 square feet of downtown real estate you could have possibly rented. It actually is extremely affordable and available for, in 2-hour chunks. So we thought, all right, let's see if we can maybe do something else with that little square of the city. So we kind of brainstormed a few things. and finally landed on this idea of creating a small public park, just a tree, turf, and a bench. And we went out one Friday and rented the parking space legally and put out the park. And, after like 15 minutes of people kind of walking by skeptically, someone came in, took off his shoes, sat down. Someone else saw that guy sitting there, brought in his pizza that, he was eating, and they started to have a conversation. And then over the next, 2 hours, people kind of cycled in and out while we just kind of watched. So that little experiment early days of the web went viral, and we started getting inquiries kind of from all over the world about, hey, can you do this in my city? Someone from Sicily wrote us, from Italy, people from Australia were writing us. We said, well, we can't, we've spent, our $300 that we had on this installation. So we wrote a manual, made it open source, kind of put the values in it that it needs to be non-commercial and need to be safe and generous and fun. And people started doing it every year. So we have had, since that day, we've had an event called Parking Day around the world, where people appropriate these small public spaces for something other than a car. And you can do anything. People have made ball pits, people have put in pool tables. It's really up to you. So that's kind of a fun one.
You're actually talking about a parking space, not
parking space,
not just the place up off the curb where, between the sidewalk and the meter. You're talking about just doing what you want with the parking space that you rented for 2 hours.
Oh yeah. I'm talking about the piece of asphalt where you park, your BMW or your Honda. Like that is, so what I think is surprising for a lot of folks, even though I think we would, if we thought about it, we would know this is true. That is owned by the public. Those spaces are ours, right? And we rent them to private individuals to store their personal property. There's very few things like that we do. And yet all of us feel like we are entitled to our private parking spaces, maybe outside of our own house. So this experiment was a little way for us to kind of nudge on that and say, what can we put here for the public, not just kind of for private convenience.
Okay, this is, now I'm thinking of little parklets that have popped up in places, in cities that I know, little tiny uses, different uses. Of course, we've taken over the streets from the pandemic. A lot of restaurants now have outdoor seating that may never go away. Talk to me some more about space use and great innovation like that.
Well, with the parklets, it's interesting. Folks may not know, a lot of people have seen parklets in their city, right? It's this kind of new thing. Cafes love them. Some of them are community spaces. Those actually developed out of Parking Day. So what happened was the city of San Francisco, the planners in the city, in the mayor's office, saw it and they said, this is cool. They met with us. They met with Rebar, our group, and said, we'd like to make this more permanent. Can you help us craft the ordinance that would create a pilot program? And so one of the things we early on sort of tried to write into that was that the spaces need to be open to everybody. It couldn't be, that you had to purchase something like a coffee or whatever to sit there. Because if you think about it, again, that is a public space, right? That is owned by us. And so to charge folks to have the privilege of occupying something that is theirs is just kind of insane. Now, I think when you store your private vehicle, it kind of is different and maybe it makes sense to get some income from that. But it was a great experiment kind of early in the 2010s. And then I think that actually set us up when the pandemic hit. We sort of had a playbook, right? We knew, hey, here's this type of space we can build pretty quickly to get people outside. And so I think that actually, had we not had Parking Day and had parklets, the pandemic it might have taken us a little longer to figure the whole thing out. But there was certainly a playbook that went all the way back to that first experiment. And the last thing I'll say on this is my hope is that we have learned something about the value of that space, even if we need to kind of make these dining sheds look better and last longer now that we're moving on, that we actually enjoy being outside.
That's huge enough right there. There's something about being able to be more flexible about our comforts when we sit outside there, that everybody's kind of got a little bit of shared struggle when it's too cold or too hot. And shared struggle is what brings people together too. Now we got to talk about the connection that public spaces allow us to in this time period. So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about something that I just love that Blaine said to me. He said, effervescent human activity comes out of vibrant human spaces, which also happen to be sustainable and right sized for the density. So this whole thing comes together at some point. Okay, we're going to take a break and we'll come back. We'll talk about effervescent human activity. Hi, I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich, founder of the Goodness Exchange and host of the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. And I want to share something wonderful with you today. So, you know how the constant negativity in the news and social media seems to be at some sort of boiling point right now? It's relentless. It can feel like all the joy and potential is being drained out of our future. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. My team and I at the Goodness Exchange are making certain that optimistic people have instant access to positive news. There are newsworthy stories out there about astounding solutions to some of the world's biggest problems, about wonders and leaps in human potential. It's not a lack of good news, it's a lack of awareness. So, if you want to try living with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, head over to goodness-exchange.com, where you can balance your media diet and feed your curiosity about a world with real-life stories, celebrating people solving the world's greatest problems. And second, you can become a Goodness Exchange member. And for just $2 a month, you can help us keep this site ad-free. And what you're going to get is high-quality, carefully curated stories all about the good that's happening in our world, and all of it sent directly to your inbox or via our beautiful app. In the face of all the negative noise and often discouraging things that happen in our personal lives, you'll be the one who can stay on your feet. You can point to possibility and be the person who makes opportunity out of setbacks. People who use the Goodness Exchange have a spring in their step. Every day they radiate joy and confidence because they know far more about the complete picture of what's going on out there in the world. You can do more and be more in a positive way for your kids, your coworkers, your family, and all the people around you, because you're going to be filled with stories of goodness, remarkable, ingenious solutions, and progress. Super simple to open the door to a new landscape of possibility for yourself and others. Just get instant access to what's right with the world and leave all the negative noise behind. You can use it every day by heading straight over to goodness-exchange.com/join. And you can get 14 days on us when you sign up for this membership. Thanks so much. We hope you'll join us in making the world a better place. There is a conspiracy of goodness going on. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably part of it. Okay, we're back. Today, we're having a lovely chat with Blaine Merker. Blaine is an urban designer who is focused on bringing us all together, making sure our city spaces are healthy and places where we can connect, instead of just sacrificing the whole darn thing to the needs of our cars. So, Blaine, keep going. Fill us in on how cities work and how we can have effervescent human activity in our streets.
Wow. Well, that's really what we spend our time working on at Gale. We, look at the way people behave in streets, and maybe I'll just share the way that we kind of developed this method. Was our founder, Jan Gale, was trained as an architect in Copenhagen, was really building these kind of modernist housing projects back in the 60s. And his wife, Ingrid, was trained as a sociologist. And she, over dinner one night, said, "Do you have any idea how the people who live in your housing projects, what they do every day or what they do in between the buildings?" And he said, "No, I don't know. I just design them." And she said, let's go. I want to teach you some methods. Let's go look. And so she taught him how to observe using quantitative ethnography. And they went to Italy, and they kind of went around all the little Italian hill towns, and they measured how much time people spent sitting outdoors and how much people sat down and what the relationship was between the number of chairs and the number of people who sat in chairs. Turns out the more chairs there are, the more people there are sitting in them. And if you don't have any chairs, there is actually no one sitting down. He developed this method and he came back to Copenhagen, and Copenhagen's, Nordic, it's chilly, it's a winter country, and he said, we need to have more people sitting outside. And everyone said, we're not Italian, that'll never work. But he nevertheless kind of he went out and started measuring people in the streets. And they found out, sure enough, that the same rules applied. The places where there was seating, where there was warmth, and it might be a heat lamp or it might just be a blanket that someone has at the cafe table, that's where the people were. And so the city embarked on an experiment over the next 40 years to gradually pedestrianize its streets. And they would, every year, they'd count the number of chairs, they'd count the number of people, they'd count the amount of time that people spent in one place. And they found out that there was a direct relationship to the amount of space that people were given and the amount of time that they would spend enjoying it. And so the city of Copenhagen changed year by year by year. And if any of your listeners have been to Scandinavia or been to a city like Copenhagen, they'll see it's one of the best places in the world to be a pedestrian and one of the best places to hang out in summer and in winter, by the way, because they've really figured out how to sort of live in the cold comfortably. I think people think that, Scandinavia is just different, or maybe the people there are more enlightened or something. They were just like us. They had their cities choked with traffic too. The difference is that kind of using this method, they carefully and incrementally changed using observation and data to give them the kind of reason to take the next step. And we really kind of have continued that since now in North America, working in cities like New York, San Francisco, Vancouver, and Chicago.
What you're talking about too is surely has to, if it already doesn't, weave back to climate change. So help us understand. And that goes back to this, how fast can we experiment? So go ahead, talk to us about all this.
Well, we don't have enough time to move slowly here, right? We need to move faster than we've ever moved on anything in society before in order to really pull ourselves back from creating a planet that I don't think is going to be too great for any of us to live on, certainly not for our children or grandchildren. So, a couple things about this. Number one is the things I think that bring us the most joy, and this is a theory, bring us the most joy, make us happy, give us meaning in life. They're carbon neutral. They're not high intensity energy use. They are being able to sort of make connections to people in your community. They are spending time with your family and loved ones. They are creating things and enjoying small moments where you live. Now, that is sort of interesting when you think about what we spend most of our energy on, right? And we go back to talking about junk mobility, right? We're spending a lot of carbon, spending a lot of energy, spending a lot of money on things that maybe don't bring us the most joy. So I'm really interested in this kind of alignment between climate action and happiness and sort of human thriving. Because I do think that the answer has to be, we solve the climate crisis and we accidentally thrive in the process. Or maybe not accidentally. Maybe we thrive on purpose because we figure out that those two things are actually related. But the world is going to change no matter what. Our lives are going to change. They're going to be upended. We're going to have a whole new economy to live in a sustainable way. So that's going to happen whether or not we solve climate change. We're either going to be disrupted completely or we're going to have to disrupt what we do. So the question is just like, what kind of world do we want to create in the process of solving climate change? And I guess where sort of public space comes into all this is public spaces work when they are activated by people living near them. Streets are activated when people live on them in close proximity, when people can walk to the corner store, when they can, bike their children to school, when they can go visit their grandparents a few doors down. That's what creates really lively streets and lively public spaces. It just happens to have that co-benefit of being the most sustainable form of urbanism that we have. And it turns out, this is research from the Cool Climate Network at UC Berkeley, that if you live in a major city, most major cities, the number one most effective climate lever that your city has to pull is to do infill urban development. It's more than electrifying your heating system. It's more than changing your diet. It is the number one thing is just to invite more neighbors into your neighborhood, especially if it's served well by public transit and it has jobs close to housing. So I think this is kind of a win-win here, right? We can create great public spaces. We can be closer to the people we love. We can be closer to the community we want to create at the same time as we're doing the best thing for climate change and we're spending less time on mobility that we don't care about.
So this is the brilliance and the hope that's in all of this. And one of the reasons why I invited you on as a guest, because as soon as I recognized that win-win-win triangle that's going on here, these are the things we have to celebrate and help rise to the top of our digital lives. It can't just be knuckles dragging doom and gloom all day long. For this exact reason, there's so much potential here. Here's something that you said that I'd love for you to comment on. You said, we've lost the culture of community sharing outside of our families.
Yeah.
And some refreshing new questions are, what can we share and what can we steward together? We can get past this. I don't even know my neighbor's name.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of us do have close neighbors, people we like, maybe some you don't, but in every neighborhood, there is a chance to create mutual reliance, mutual stewardship, kind of shared purpose around stewarding the physical environment where we live. And there are movements around the country to do this around neighborhood streets, right? There's a project that started in Portland, Oregon called Intersection Repair, where folks, will paint kind of big graphics and mandalas in the center of their, neighborhood intersection. Kids coming out with the paint and they put benches out and they'll put like sharing stations and little libraries and stuff. When that first happened, actually in Portland, the Bureau of Streets came out and they removed everything. The mayor found out about it. And she said, if someone in the neighborhood is trying to make their street better, never take it out again. I want you to find a way to make this possible for any neighborhood to do. And so that's kind of taken off as a movement. It looks different everywhere. City of Barcelona has created these things called supermanzanas, super blocks, which are basically taking several of the city blocks and then removing traffic on the interior streets and making those play zones and places for people, like kind of mini parks. It has the benefit also of actually reducing traffic congestion because it rationalizes the grid. So there's all kinds of ways that we can kind of create shared stewardship and purpose. And in the end, what you're stewarding is not just a space, you're really stewarding a relationship with your neighbors. We have kind of given over, care of our public realm to the government, which is going to make me sound like kind of a, blazing libertarian or something, but I don't think it should just be the government's job to provide public space. That's like, we have to do that. We have to fill it with the social purpose. But I think many people kind of see, the street as sort of not for them. Why can't it be? So yeah, take a chance, ask a neighbor if they want to take down your fence in the backyard, or even better, do something in front together, like tear up the extra sidewalk and plant a tree, or work with your city to find out if you can do traffic calming or narrowing of the street, create some places for people other than drivers to use that space.
Did this start back? I just am thinking of little sparks of light that I remember seeing over the last 30 years, especially when the whole TED movement came. Do you remember a guy that was called the Guerrilla Gardener?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was one of these people that kind of had this little tiny mini park, pop-up park kind of things. Give us just some more examples of things that you know of that we might not, if we're not city dwellers, or obviously we don't all live in the same cities. Some cool places around the world or that you know of.
Yeah, I mean, there are places where this is happening in big cities and small towns. And on kind of one end of the spectrum, you've got a place like Times Square, which is really one of the first big American projects that we worked on at Gale. People might remember that Times Square in the early 2000s was mostly kind of a taxi traffic jam. We studied it. The Bloomberg administration asked us to take a look at it, to be able to change it kind of overnight and reverse it overnight if we needed to. Bloomberg's sort of the data guy and he wanted to see numbers. And so we found a lot of statistics about it. But the one thing that was probably the most impactful politically is we noticed that 90% of the users, which were people walking, were in 10% of the space. And 90% of the space was devoted to cars, and that was actually 10% of the users. So it was exactly reversed. And, that kind of gave everyone the courage to say, well, we could like move the needle, 5%, we could move it 10%. So they moved it like 80% and went from sort of lawn chairs and paint to a full redesign of Times Square, which, hey, Times Square isn't for everyone. I don't want to spend more than 15 minutes there, like getting hugged by giant Mickey Mouses and stuff. But it has created a space where people can come together and really feel that kind of amazing community in New York City. So that's on the large scale, but there's places on the smaller scale, like there's a great city called Carmel, Indiana, where their mayor has really championed biking and bike paths as a driver of development. So he's created this beautiful trail that we worked on called the Monin Trail downtown. And it's really like a biking oriented redevelopment program where all the new buildings and Main Street kind of front on this bike trail. And so you can actually experience the whole city just by biking. There's smaller towns around the country, like city of Mountain View, where we're working, is turning over their kind of Main Street to create a pedestrian plaza. You'll find it everywhere, and you'll find it a lot of times in temporary programs, because through the pandemic and even before, cities were really experimenting with this kind of temporary pedestrianization. And where I see the kind of hill to get over is in making those permanent, because it costs a lot and it's a big political choice sometimes to really commit to it. So I think if that's something that you're excited about, city councils love to hear from people. If you can support that in your own city, it's worth checking out.
So that reminds me of a comment that you made along the way somewhere about this, that we don't sacrifice. So we tell ourselves stories about the sacrifice that we're making. And then so often we find out that it was just a story we were telling ourselves. We think it's a sacrifice. I won't be able to go straight home, straight down that street I went down 100 times. But we don't also tell ourselves the stories of what's possible if we give up that. I mean, your example of Times Square and the 10%, 90% rule.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times what we actually so human beings are hardwired to be loss averse, right? You will get more pushback from someone, and this is totally proven by psychology, that you will get more pushback from somebody if you try to take something away than people will care about getting something new. So, we're not very good at understanding the new thing that we haven't experienced before, but we're very good at protecting the old thing, even if the old thing is maybe not that great if we really think about it. And I think it's just a good thing to sort of know about human behavior. So whenever I talk to people about what there is to gain by creating a more human-centered city, I try to start with what people already know, what they already have experienced. For a lot of folks, you ask, like, where do you go on vacation when you can go to a city? And people will talk about, strolling on some beautiful street in Portugal and like drinking wine and watching the sunset. And you say, like, well, so climate similar here. Could you do that here? And it's like, well, no, but I need to get out of here. And it's just there's too much traffic and it's kind of ugly, So when we kind of talk about where we like what we love, we've all experienced these great places before. We've all experienced, maybe if you know how to ride a bike, you've experienced the joy of what it is to ride a bike on a quiet street. So it's really just about making that experience the rule rather than the exception, making it the thing that you get for free every day instead of the thing that you had to pay $5,000 to go, see as a tourist.
That's such a great point too. That you can't be here and not mention about our exposure to diversity. And that can be anything from the busker that's playing some kind of music that we never heard or never thought we might like. There's a famous video where Yo-Yo Ma is sitting in a train station playing one of his favorite pieces, and people are just zooming by and not even realizing what's going on. But then there's the diversity of running into people who aren't like us, and the way that spaces have us interacting. Talk to us about how biases go up and down when you bring people together.
Well, I think we've all had experiences of being in our own bubble, and our neighborhoods might be a bubble. You might not see anyone who doesn't look like you, or maybe you can tell when a stranger walks by and you're not, you feel like they're not from here. It's a really interesting thing because our brains are hardwired to map ideas of community and belonging onto spatial memory. So we have a real strong perception of sort of what is a safe environment based on like where we are. Well, we talked a little bit about some of the problems of that around things like single family zoning, right? There's, if you don't know the story about it, it's really quite sad. It's, single family zoning, which seems like kind of a benign thing, right? It seems like some technical designation, really was used as a tool to separate people of color out of cities into, it's called redlining, make sure that they could only buy homes in redline zones. So the negative consequence of that, I think, for everybody, is that we started to live in a segregated society. And segregated societies aren't great, right? For a lot of things. They reduce our empathy, allow us to kind of other people, right? To sort of consider them not as human as us. So there's good research, though, that shows that when you encounter people who look different from you in a more regular and constant way, your tolerance for diversity goes up and your curiosity and goodwill towards other people goes up. But it goes up at a certain point. It has to be above seeing kind of the random person who doesn't look like you. So these researchers, they studied people on trains, and they had this natural experiment where they would have folks with dark skin go into primarily white trains, and they would, see how people kind of responded when there was only one versus when there were like many folks that were diverse in the community. And they found that the more diversity there was, the more tolerance there was. And there was more suspicion when there was kind of only a couple of people who looked different. So I guess the point of all this, and it's fascinating stuff to get into, is, we need to strive to have cities that create environments where we get to see each other, where we get to be among people who are different from us and who also have different life circumstances, because it helps us appreciate everybody. And it also means that there is opportunity for everybody, right? If a diverse group of people can be in a place, they're sharing the opportunity of living there. And just add one more point to this, which is that the researcher Raj Chetty has shown that the zip code where you grow up has as much to do with your life circumstances economically, with how much you're going to earn in your life, as actually how much money you had or your family had growing up. So in other words, it's more important what neighborhood you live in for opportunity than almost anything else. So the best thing we can do for equity actually is really integrate our neighborhoods and invite neighbors in who may not look like us.
It's such a beautiful way of thinking about possibility, because I can't get off this, that it seems like such a win-win. You get more diverse folks, you get more diverse restaurants, you get more diverse ways that your children think about the world. You get less fear and more joy because you get exposure to things that you've never known. And let's wrap up with this notion of pride in place as well. Because I think where you're going with this is that anybody who's kind of a naysayer who might be listening to this conversation, which I don't think there probably are very many, but they might be saying, wow, we can't have everybody on the streets. There'll be garbage everywhere and there'll be people sleeping on the benches and all the things, right? But I suspect that there's research on that pride in place kind of buoys the whole system from everyone, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, the best neighborhoods, we know when we're in them, right? They're clean. There's people who live there, take ownership, take pride in it. People use the spaces. And when you see people using the spaces, they're not just the people who don't have anywhere else to be or who don't have anywhere to sleep. It's everybody. And I think what's interesting about, say, seeing homeless folks sleeping out in public is that we've studied this, and it's not that there are higher numbers of homeless people people who are experiencing homelessness. It's the spaces are devoid of other people. And so you notice more if no one else is owning that space, right? If you've got a busy plaza and, 200 folks are there enjoying coffee and sunning themselves and the kids are playing, and like two of those people or five of those people are sleeping out, you don't really notice. And I think that's sort of something that it goes back to this idea of what are streets for. We in America have kind of taken as a given that streets are not for everyone. They are for people who don't have any other choice. And what if they were for everyone? I think it might sort of flip how we think about what being on the street means. Now, that's not to downplay all the kind of help that those folks need, or the kind of investment in mental health and social services and the public realm that we need to have, right? So that's a key ingredient. We can't have pride in place if we have disinvestment. And we can't have disinvestment if we believe that public investment is only for me, right? And if I invest in someone else who's going to benefit from it who doesn't look like me, but then I don't want to invest. So it's this thing where you got to be generous, right? It starts with generosity. You got to say, hey, this isn't just my neighborhood, and it's maybe the benefits of it aren't just for me, but I'm going to trust that if everybody gets something out of this place, that it's going to be better for me too, because it will be. So I would just kind of say, for anyone who feels nervous about inviting in more neighbors, for inviting in more activity, and I get it, change is definitely tricky, but try to operate from that place of generosity and say, like, this could be better for me too in the end, and it certainly could be really better for some other folks. And by the way, we got to do it because it is the single best lever we have for fixing climate change and other problems.
Well, Blaine, my face hurts a little bit from smiling too much through this whole thing. I can't tell you how much hope and light you've shown on this matter just in 1 hour. And I want to remind people that you can look up Blaine's name on the internet and find some other talks that he's given that I was first attracted to. And of course, we'll connect you to the Goodness Exchange article about this exact topic that has a beautiful video that I first saw Blaine speaking in. So thank you so much. Let's wrap up on where people can connect with you, or do you want people to connect with you? What should people do next?
Please connect. Please connect. I love connecting. Yeah, people can email me. I'll go ahead and give my email here at the risk of putting it all over the internet, but it already is. So it's Blaine, BLAINE, at GalePeople.com, GEHL people.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at Blaine Merck, and follow Gale too. I have about 100 just amazing colleagues at Gale who also write and post and think about all kinds of things about urbanism, about street life, about the arts and the environment. And you might love to follow them too. And their handle, or the Gale's handle on all the social media, is at Cities for People.
Oh, terrific. Thank you so, so much. For any of the things that Blaine and I mentioned here, you'll find them in the show notes. Head on over to the Goodness Exchange as well and join us there for people exactly like Blaine who are thinking fresh thoughts. They're the thoughtful, measured voices, the helpers that are out there in numbers that we need to give our attention to now. So thanks, Blaine. I hope that all the connections to goodness and progress that Blaine and I shared with you today carry you through your week, and you start finding all the joy and wonder that we've been talking about.
Thanks a lot. It's great joining this conversation with you.
All right. Terrific. Thanks so much, Blaine. Have a good week, everybody.